Good morning, everybody. We are holding Daf Ches Amud Aleph. We are holding by the second Mishnah on the Amud. We're doing a review on chapter 1. And just to be able to help, I'm going to share with you from the Rambam. This is in Chusrei Kippurim, chapter 2, halacha 6, where it says more or less what we're going to read in the Mishnah. It says when a person experiences one zav discharge, this is a sickness that a person sometimes has. We don't have it today, but they used to have it in those times. So his status is equivalent to that of one who has a seminal emission, in the sense that he doesn't have to count any days. Once it has passed, he can just go to the mikveh and he can become pure. The Rambam continues, if he experiences 2 discharges, this is what we call a zav condition. He must count 7 clean days and then immerse into a mikvah. He is not, however, obligated to bring a sacrifice. If he experiences 3 discharges, then he is a zav in the full sense of the term and is obligated, in addition to counting 7 days, he's obligated to bring a sacrifice. We say there's no difference between a zav who experienced 2 discharges and one who experienced 3, except the obligation to bring a sacrifice. Okay, which means to say that just as someone who receives who has 3 discharges, they become a full-fledged zav, and they are metame others, and they have special laws associated to them. The same would apply to somebody who saw only twice. The difference between seeing twice and 3 times is only the obligation of the carbon, but all the other stringencies that are associated with being a zav after seeing 3 times apply after seeing it twice. Is that understood? Okay, so there are going to be more things that I might share in terms of viewing some of the verses to be able to understand. So we're going to do the Mishnah and then the Gemara. So it says in the Mishnah that there's no difference between a zav who experiences 2 emissions and one who experiences 3 emissions, except for the requirement to bring an offering, right? But everything else would remain the same. If you saw only once, the Mishnah doesn't mention about seeing once, because seeing only once, we said, you do not count as a zav, and you are just considered as if you're someone who had a regular emission, and you would just go to the mikveh once that's passed, right? But once you see it twice, and remember, here we're not talking about seeing it twice in 2 days. It could even be seeing it twice in 1 day. It doesn't matter. So long as there were 2 occurrences, then you move from being someone who saw only once to being somebody who saw twice, and then you do have to count 7 days. But again, if you only saw it once, then you do not count 7 days at all. Okay. Yes.
So if they had 1, they had to wait and see if they have more? No,
you don't have to wait.
How do they know they had 2 in 2 days?
What happens is if somebody wakes up in the morning and this happens to him, then once it passes, if he wants, he can go to the mikvah. If he doesn't want to go to the mikvah because he wants to make sure that this isn't something more serious, he can wait, right? He can wait. And if he sees a second time, then he will have to count the 7 days. What happens if he went into the mikvah in between the first time and the second time? He thought, okay, that was just a one-off. So then the second time this happens would tell him that it's more serious, and therefore he has to count 7 days. So his going to the mikvah really accomplished nothing. Okay.
So the first mikvah wouldn't count.
That's correct. Okay. The mikvah would only count if he doesn't have another sighting for 24 hours.
Right.
Because if any time between the first sighting and 24 hours later, he has a second sighting, which means the second day, then then it's going to be considered two sightings. If there's a 24-hour interval between the two, then we would consider this a first occurrence, if you understand what I'm saying. Yep.
Yeah, it would be a single.
Yeah. Okay. So
Rabbi,
now
where are we?
we're holding Daf Ches Amud Aleph, the second Mishnah. We just went through the Mishnah about Azav. There's no difference between Azav who experiences two emissions and somebody who experiences three, except for the requirement to bring a carbon. But in terms of the counting and everything and the other things, as the Gemara is going to say in a minute, they're the same. The laws are going to be the same. So the Gemara says that the implication of the Mishnah is that with regards to Mishkav and Moshav, right, and the counting of 7, they're the same. Now, what's this idea of Mishkav and Moshav? So when it comes to a Zav, right, a Zav who experiences more than 2 occurrences, right, he becomes what's called an Av Hatuma, okay? And if he sits or he lies on like a mat or a cushion or something like that, right, he makes them as a primary source of Tumah, which itself can transmit Tumah to people or to utensils, right? So this is a very severe level of Tumah, okay? There are a lot of unique laws associated with a Zav, right? He can make other things an Av Hatuma just by sitting on it. If he touches it, it doesn't become an Av Hatuma, but if he sits on it or he lies on it, then he makes that thing, that object, let's say a mat or a couch, he makes it an Av Hatuma. And also, he can cause something to become Tomei by moving it indirectly. And furthermore, there's another stringency where we know that when it comes to a kli cheres, right, an earthenware vessel, the only way it can become Tomei is by the Tumah entering into its space in the inside of it. If it's something touches from the outside, it doesn't become Tomei. But with a Zav could make that earthenware vessel become Tameh, even if he doesn't touch from the inside, even if he causes it to be moved from the outside, nevertheless, it could become Tameh. So there's a lot of these extra stringencies when it comes to a Zav. And the point of our Mishnah here is that even though if you only had 2 experiences of this flow, then although you don't end up bringing a carbon like the one who had 3 experiences of it, nevertheless, all the other unique laws associated with Zav apply to you as well. That's the point of the Mishnah. But now the Gemara wants to know, where do we know this from? Where do we know that when it comes to a somebody having 3 experiences versus 2 experiences, that you do bring a carbon and you don't bring a carbon, and that you have to wait 7 days even though you don't bring a carbon if it only happened twice? Where do you know all these laws from? So the Gemara says that we have a brisa, and Reb Simai, he teaches that we learn it from a particular verse, and for this I need to share with you a pasuk. 1 second, not this one. Sorry, it's this one, chapter 15. Okay, so it says as follows, right? It says that, okay, in verse 2, it says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, if any man has a discharge from his flesh, his discharge is unclean. Okay, so we've got over here, zav mibsoroi zoivoi tamehu. So there's 2 mentions of zav over here. Okay, and then in the third case, in the third verse, it says, and this shall be the nature of his uncleanliness due to his discharge, right? And concludes and says, or if his flesh is plugged by his discharge, that is his uncleanliness. Okay? So now, the Gemara says as follows, right? This is what Reb Simoy says. Let me stop the share for a minute and continue with what we're saying. The Gemara says as follows. It says the Torah, the pasuk, enumerates 2 emissions and called him Tamei, and then a third time calls him Tamei. Right? He mentions Zav again a third time and calls him Tamei. Why do you have it be calling him Tamei after 2 mentions of Zoivai, and then go back and mention it again a third time? How do you have a difference between 2 and a difference between 3? So he says the difference is going to be that if Ezav is Tamei after 2 times seeing a flow, right, then it teaches me that he becomes Tamei. But if it mentions it 3 times, meaning after a third experience, then he has to bring a korban. Okay, does everybody understand that? Let's go back to the room for a minute.
That's what we said from the beginning.
Right, but again, in pasuk base, at the end of the pasuk, it already says he's Tamei. Okay, so that's after 2 times mentioning. Ki yezav mibsorei zoivai, yeah, Tamei. That's 2 times, right? And then it goes on, and in verse 3 mentions it a third time, meaning saying after the third mention of the Zav, you mentioned he's Tamei again. Why is there an extra time that we're talking about him becoming Tamei? We've already said it in the previous verse. Why do you need to tell me again that he's becoming Tamei? To tell us there's actually a difference in the laws. So now the Gemara comes along and says, how do we know that we're reading this correctly? Perhaps we're reading it incorrectly, or rather interpreting it incorrectly. You're telling me that when it says the 2 references and then says Tamei, that it refers only to Tuma, and the third time it says Tamei, it's referring to Korban. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe what we're saying is that 2 flows that the person has bring him to the stringent Tuma of Ezav, and do not bring him to an offering of a Korban. But 3 times, once it mentions 3 times, then the law will be that he has to bring a korban, but he doesn't have the stringent tumah. Now, why the Gemara asks this question is difficult, because the Gemara is going to refute it and say it's illogical. But nevertheless, the Gemara does this perhaps to just cover its bases, right? To say that we've checked everything out. But the Gemara answers that how could you have such a suggestion by saying that a person can become a severe level of tumah? He can become a severe level of tumah, right? After 2 experiences of this flow. But then in the third time, right, he's all of a sudden going to lose that tumah and just have to bring a korban. He's already seen it twice. So therefore, it's illogical. Once you see it twice, you have that tumah, and it does not change once you have it the third time. So the Gemara says, okay, but still maybe we could perhaps suggest that there's another way to interpret it and say that the 2 emissions bring him to an obligation of bringing up a korban, and not to the stringent tumah. And the third time where it's mentioned in the pasuk is to tell me that if you saw an emission a third time, then that's when you get the stringent levels of tumah that we discussed earlier that happened for a zav. So the Gemara says, no, that can't be. And the reason why that can't be is because there's another brisa. And the brisa says, here I'm going to share the verse again. I'm sorry. Right over here, if you go down to, I think it's verse 15, right? So when it talks about bringing a korban, right, it says in verse 15, and the kohen shall make them, one into a sin offering and one into a burnt offering, and the kohen shall effect atonement for him from his discharge, mizoivoi, in front of Hashem. Mizoivoi. Now the word mizoivoi, this word mizoivoi, the Gemara is going to make a drasha on. So let's do it inside. So he says like this, that what? He says you can't say because there's a pasuk. The pasuk, the Brisa teaches us that when it says in the pasuk, and the Kohen shall provide him atonement for Hashem from his emission, mi zoivoi, the mi zoivoi, the mem at the beginning of the word tells me that it's only in some cases of a zov do you bring an offering, and some do not bring an offering. So now how so? It's if he experienced 3 emissions, he brings an offering. If only 2 emissions, he does not bring an offering. So now the Gemara says, well, 1 second, maybe maybe if he experienced 2 emissions, he brings an offering. If he experiences 3 emissions, he does not bring an offering. So the Gemara rejects that, saying that's impossible. Just like I said before, once you see twice, right? Obviously, the person who sees 3 times is included in somebody who saw twice because he already saw twice. So you'd have to bring a carbon. But the point is that we have 2 sources that complement one another, teaching me this idea that there's a distinction between seeing twice and 3 times, and that distinction is the notion that you have to bring a carbon only after the 3rd time. So now the Gemara asks, but why do I need to have both? Why do I need to have the brisa of Reb Simoi and the brisa that brings from the pasuk that says v'chipa olav hakein lifnei Hashem mi zoivai? So he says I need to have both, and the reason is because if I would have only had the brisa of Reb Simoi, right, that he says that the first 3 psukim in the chapter, so the 2nd pasuk and the 3rd pasuk, right, are enumerate 3 times this idea of zoivoi, and after 2 times it says Tomei, and then after the 3rd time it says Tomei, I would still have the question that maybe what we're saying is that the first time is to tell me about the carbon, and the 2nd time is to tell me about the tuma. So that's why that's why we need to have this 2nd brisa to tell me mizoivai, to tell me that only some cases of a zov you bring a carbon and others don't. In other words, as follows. Let me just explain for a minute. You have 1 sighting, 2 sightings, and 3 sightings. The 1 sighting doesn't count, okay? Because we said he's not considered to be a proper zov, right? So the only real zov is if you saw twice or if you saw 3 times. And out of those 2, when we use the word mizoivai, it comes to exclude. It comes to exclude 1, that only sometimes you will bring a carbon and sometimes you won't. If you're going to exclude, the only one you could exclude is the 2nd one, right? Excuse me, the only one you could exclude is the first one of the person who sees 2 times, right? So therefore, that is why we need to have both Reb Simoi's brisa and the pasuk, the 2nd brisa, which says that from the word mizoivoi, we learn this idea that only when you see it 3 times you bring a carbon. And what happens if you would have said the other one? Excuse me. What if you would have only had the 2nd brisa, which says that we learn out from the last word of that pasuk mizoivoi, that it teaches me only some do and some don't. He said, if that's the case, and I didn't have Reb Simoi's brisa, I would have said mizoivoi. Mizoivoi could mean some sightings, but I don't know how many, which means to say, at what point do we start saying that you have to bring a carbon? Is it after 2 times, after 3 times, after 26 times? How am I supposed to know how many times it's talking about that from this point on, all the numbers of sightings that you have of this flow require you to bring a carbon, and the ones less than that, you don't bring a carbon, which is why I need to have the drush of Reb Simai, who tells me that after you've seen it twice, starting from the 3rd time, that's when you have to bring the carbon. So that's why we need to have both. Is that understood? Yep. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So now the Gemara asks, okay, you're telling me that from the word mizoivai, we have a drasha, and that drasha comes to exclude 2 times versus 3 times. 3 times you bring a carbon, twice you don't. Okay, so now that you've said that this mizoivoi comes to teach me a drasha, right? What do I do with a verse that comes later on? Okay, so let's pull it back up. Verse 13. Verse 13, it says as follows. When the man with the discharge is cleansed of his discharge, he shall count 7 days for his purification, and then immerse his garments and immerse his flesh in spring water, and he shall become clean, right? So, what are the first 4 words over there? Vechiyitar hazov mizlayvoi, right? When the man with the discharge is cleansed of his discharge. Now, I could have just read the verse and said, V'chiyitar hazov, skip the next word, mizayvoi, right? And read V'sofra lashim v'syamim, and count 7 days. So you're telling me that in verse 15, right? You see verse 15, at the end, the last word, mizayvoi, tells me only when you see 3 times, not when you see 2 times. That's when you bring the carbon. So in verse 13, when it tells me that when the man with the discharge is cleansed, right, from his discharge, what would that be coming to exclude? That's the question of the Gemara. You understand the question of the Gemara? Yeah. You told me mizoivai is coming to exclude something. Well, in this pasuk, in pasuk 13, what is it coming to exclude? The Gemara says, this we need for the following teaching that was taught in the Brisa, that it says that when the Zav is cleansed, this means that when he ceases from his emission, he can immediately begin counting the 7 days. What does that mean? You might think that in order for a Zav to be able to start counting his clean days, he should first need to become pure, right? I.e., go to the mikvah, right? Another thing we learned, right? So therefore, therefore it tells me that you can start counting straight away. But now there's another thing that we learn from this as well, and this is as follows. A bit complicated, but just follow me. What happens if you are very unlucky? Not only do you have this this condition of being a zav, right, which is some kind of illness, right? You also have tzaras. Okay, so you have 2 things going against you. You have tzaras and you have this being a zav. So now, what happens when you finished seeing, right, 2 times this this flow coming out of you, but you still have saras on you? Can you start counting 7 days from being a zav so that you can go to the mikveh at the end of those 7 days? Or do you have to wait until you become no longer a metzora, and then you can start counting the 7 days? So the Gemara is telling us that this verse 13, where it says mizoivoi, is telling you that you don't have to wait until the tzaras goes away before you start counting the 7 days of being a zav. Okay.
What are you going, Rebbe? What are you going to do when you counted the 7 days? And now you're done with that. So what are you going to do?
This is an excellent question. The issue here is like this. We said at the beginning of the shir, right, that there are certain unique laws that are associated with being a zav. So, for example, he's metana mishka v'moshav, right? So this idea of being metana mishka v'moshav doesn't apply in the same way to a metzora as it does to a zav. So do I say that he can go to the mikveh now, and although he's still tamei because of being a metzora, but nevertheless he's gotten rid of that extra thing of being a zav? And if he's going to lose that extra tuma, right, that's going to be a benefit for him to be able not to pass on the tumah in the extra ways that apply only to a zav and not to a metzora. Okay, so now, yeah.
They were in New Jersey. So, also, is he going to go to the
And then the Gemara, one second, yeah.
Rabbi, you have to mute people.
I'm sorry, yeah, one
There's
second.
a lot of background noise.
Okay,
Yeah.
Doing that right now. So now. One second. Okay. Mizayvai v'safar, from his emissions he shall count, teaches us that what? This teaches about a zav who experiences only 2 missions and thus is being cleansed from his emissions, meaning from a limited condition of zav, that he requires a counting of 7 clean days before immersion, right? So,
But Rabbi,
yeah,
after 7 days, you'll clear the zav, but you will still have tzarat.
that's correct. But at
You
least
still have to count for the tzarat.
but the tzaras is a separate issue. The tzaras is a separate issue. It has its own set of laws around the tzaras, right?
But no, but not to forget that he still will have tzarat, and he'll have to count again when he's.
But that's true. He will have but the question is, what happens to the things that he comes into contact with during this period of time? The laws will change once he goes to the mikvah from being a zav. Even though some of the laws of Tumah will still apply in terms of him being a Metzora, but he will no longer have the laws that are applying in terms of him being a Zav.
Mishkan and Mishkav is only for a Zav? It's not for a Metzora?
I think that with regards to the Zav, right, there's also an additional thing of the Hesed, right? That the moving, that he can make something, even a kli cheres, become tamei even without touching the inside, which is not true of a metzora. So there's an extra stringency over there that applies to him. But the Brisa questions the need for a pasuk to teach that a zav of only 2 emissions requires 7 days, 7 clean days, right? Why do I need to have a special pasuk to tell me this? Isn't it something that can be derived logically? Why? Because if we're going to say, right? If we're going to say that a guy who sees for 2 days, right? Not 2 days, but two occurrences of a flow, right? So that makes him a real zav. And we're going to say that he's metame mishkav u'moshav, right? Certainly, if he's going to have those extra stringencies applied to him, why do I need the special pasuk to tell me that he's going to have to count 7 days, just like the guy who has 3 sightings, right? Why wouldn't that be logical, right? Counting 7 days, right, is something that I would consider to be less severe than the ability to make something else an av hatuma if I sit on it, right? So therefore, it should be logical to know that I'm going to have to count 7 days, just like the guy who has 3 sightings. Says the Gemara that it's actually not so simple, because we have an instance where you have someone who's going to be metame mishkav u'moshav, right? They're going to make everything that they sit on to become an av hatuma, and nevertheless they don't have to count for 7 days in order to go to the mikvah. And who's that? That is what we call a zava ketana. Okay, so here for this, you need to understand a little bit about the laws of Midah. We went over it when we learned this the first time, but chazar is always good, okay? A woman who has a flow of blood, okay? When she's having this flow of blood for the first 7 days, that is considered to be dam nida, blood of nida. At the end of the 7 days, she can go to the mikveh. Okay? Now, when a woman continues to see blood after those 7 days, that blood has a new it's a new definition. It's no longer considered to be dam nida, it's called dam ziva. Okay, dam ziva has its own unique laws. When she's a zava ketana, if she only sees this flow of blood for 1 day, then she has to wait 1 day against it. Shemeres yoim keneged yoim. But during that period that she's waiting, right, she's keeping 1 day against the other, right? She has to have a full clean day before she can go to the mikvah. During that day, right, when she's a zava ketana, she still has the full severity of being a zava that makes something tamei or as an avatuma, right? This is not like the zav who only has one flow, one unnatural flow where he can go to the mikveh straight, the mikveh straight away, right? It's like the person who has to, who is a zav who saw twice. She, when she's a zava ketana, right? She doesn't count 7 days, but still is metameh mishkav u'moishav. She still makes everything an avatuma when she sits on it. If that's the case, we have an instance where you have mishkav u'moishav and you don't wait 7 days. Therefore, we needed to have a special pasuk to tell me, even though you now know that he's metameh mishkav u'moishav, you still don't necessarily know that he has to wait 7 days. So the pasuk tells me that you have to wait 7 days. Okay? That's why the pasuk came along and says, "Mizoivai v'sofar," that mixas zoivai v'sofar, from his emissions he shall count, which implies that one who seeks to be cleansed from a partial emission, meaning from only 2, he should count 7 clean days, right? So this teaches about a zav who experiences even 2 emissions and requires a counting of 7 days. So now, until now, we were saying that the term mizoivon, right, is coming to exclude something. It's an exclusionary term, which means to say, right, when we used the word mizoivon in terms of a korban, we said only if you see 3 times, not if you see twice. Here we're saying mizoivon is an inclusionary term. It's coming to tell you that even if you only saw twice, you still have to count 7 days. So the question Rav Papa asks Abaya is, what's the difference between this expression, right, that it comes to include, and that expression of mizoivai, the first one that we mentioned in the beginning, right, which comes to exclude. So he said, one second. So the question is, what's the difference between the two? So Abai says to Papa that the truth is, you're right. In both cases, it should be exclusionary. However, in the second case, in the case where we come and we say that it includes having to count 7 days, even if you only had 2 flows, right, is because had the pasuk not said anything, right, then had you not mentioned mizoivai altogether, we would have had no reason to include a zav who experienced only 2 emissions in the requirement of counting 7 days. So the fact that you said mizoivai, we have to come along and say that it's coming to include. In other words, if you would have kept quiet altogether, the assumption would have been that the zav doesn't count 7 days if he only saw twice. The fact that you say anything and you say mizoivai, and there's no other use of this word. It's not coming to teach me anything else. It's not coming to exclude anything else. So therefore, the fact that the pasuk comes and says it all together tells me that it's almost like a double negative, which makes a positive, right? It's coming along and it's saying something when it didn't have to say something, not to exclude, but rather to include. And what is it coming to include? That even someone who only has seen twice and therefore doesn't have to bring a korban, nevertheless, he needs to count 7 days. And you might come along and say, well, what about the fact that you have a shemeres yom keneged yom? And so we see that the idea of counting 7 days, right? The idea of counting 7 days is not necessarily associated with the stringencies that are associated with being a zav or a zava, right? So he says, one second. I'm sorry. You might think that I don't need a pasuk because I could have learned it out logically. So we already answered that because you have the idea of the shemer yom keneged yom. So therefore, it's not so obvious. That's why the pasuk had to add the word mizayva. In other words, I'm sorry, I'm confusing everybody here. Let me just explain it again, right? Logic would tell me, right, that once you're saying the word mizayva, right, when you didn't have to say anything, right? Therefore, I'm going to assume that you're coming to include the one who saw 2 times. You might say, no, that you didn't have to say anything at all, and I would have learned it out logically. Right? That he has to count. Why would I understand it logically? I'm sorry. Okay, let's do it again. I'm going to do it inside. Amalei Abaya. So Amalei Abaya says replies to Papa. He says, if you're going to assume that this expression of mezoivai, right, in the context of 7 clean days, comes to exclude Zav, who experienced only 2 emissions from counting the 7 clean days, rather than to include him, then lishta kramine. Then the pasuk should have just remained silent. Had the pasuk not mentioned from his emission altogether, we would have no reason to include a Zav who experienced only 2 emissions in the requirement to count 7 days. You might think, and perhaps you will argue, that had the pasuk not mentioned mizayvai, it would have been derived from a logical derivation from the fact that a zav of 2 emissions requires 7 clean days. Therefore, the expression from mizayvai is needed to exclude him from the obligation. Yes. Okay, so therefore that's not we answered that. That's not a valid argument, because in other words, we're trying to suggest that perhaps Mizovai is trying to exclude him, because you would have thought logically to include him, but we're saying that no, that's not the case, because we have the shemeres yom keneged yom, which determines, right, which tells us, which proves to us that you could have 2 separate things: the severity of being a zav, and yet at the same time not going to the mikvah, because that's what happens with the zav ketana, that she doesn't count, not going to the mikvah, but not having to count 7 days. And what about, perhaps you might argue that this expression mizoivoi is needed to teach mizoivoi v'lo minigoi, which means to say that we said before, right? Mizoivoi and not minigoi means he doesn't have to wait until the end of being a tsaras in order to be able to start counting the 7 days. So again, we say that the lichtov krov v'chiyitar hazov v'lishtok mizoivoi lamali, right? Says the pastor could have said, and when the zav is cleansed, right? And why does it have to say mizoivoi? It comes to teach you that a zav that sees twice needs to count 7. So let's go back to the pasuk for 1 second. I'm going to show you what he's referring to over here. In verse 13, it says v'chiyitar hazav mizoivoi, right? So when the man is discharged from mizoivoi, but I wouldn't have to say the word mizoivoi, right? if I wasn't coming to, one second. I could have known this without saying the word mizoivoi. So therefore, the mizoivoi is coming to tell us that it's only a zav who experiences two missions that he requires counting 7 days clean to become tar, as we said earlier in the brisa. Okay, any questions before we move on?
I want to say so far, we always go back to the first pasuk, 2 times you count 7 and 3 times you count 7. The difference is only a korban.
That's correct.
Doesn't matter if it's tzarat or if it's not, whatever it is, it's always going back to the first pasuk.
Well, we need the first pasuk, and we need the 2 pasukim, and we need the other pasuk about we need the other pasuk over here. 1 second.
To be sure that there's no interference, but it always goes back to the first pasuk.
No, and also we need the pasuk 15, right, which tells us to teach me that only sometimes, in some cases, does a zav bring a korban, in other cases he doesn't. The case that you bring a korban is when there's 3 sightings, not when there's 2 sightings. That's okay. That's the end of the zav. Now we're up to the next Mishnah, where the Mishnah talks about the differences between a metzora musgar and a metzora muchlat. Now, what's that? Okay, so the Torah tells us as follows. The Torah tells us, right, that when a person has tzaras, or what looks to him to be tzaras, right, what he has to do is he has to go to the kohen to be checked out. And there are 2 things that you need to know about tzaras. Number 1, you have the actual appearance of tzaras, right? That something appears on your flesh, right? And there are simone tuma. Simone tuma are like 2 white hairs that grow. There are other things that the size that it grows in size. So if a person comes to a kohen and he shows the kohen, right? He shows the kohen is what he thinks is tzaras. If it has everything, all the criteria are met to be a tzaras, so then the kohen says, you're a metzora, you're tamei, right? And he sends him off to be confined, and that's a guaranteed full-fledged metzora. But then you have a metzora where it looks like there could be an issue, but it is not absolutely clear. And we want to wait to see whether some white hairs will grow or whether it will extend in size. And so therefore what we do is we go and we tell him to seclude himself, right? And during that seclusion, we wait to see what happens to his tzaras. If he comes back at the end of the week and it hasn't grown, nothing has changed, right? So then he's let free, he can go, right? But if something has changed, right, and it's grown simonim, then it becomes tar. So the question is, what's the difference? What's the difference between a metzora musgar and a metzora muchlat? Okay, so the Mishnah says the only difference is that with regards to somebody who's a metzora muchlat, he has to let his hair grow and he has to rip his garments, right? Whereas somebody who's gone into a hesger, in other words, he's not confirmed, but he has to go into quarantine, then he doesn't have to let his hair grow and he doesn't have to rend his garment. Then we go on to say there's no difference. Yep.
So the priya and prima is just so people will see that he is metzora?
No.
Then why does he do that?
Because that's what the Torah says he has to do. It's just like mourning in an Avel. He rips his garments and he lets his hair grow. So too a Metzora does. That the Torah tells us that that's what a Metzora has to do. That's what a confirmed Metzora has to do.
Okay.
That's with regards to what he has to do on the determination that he has to go into quarantine. the one who's mukhlat has to grow his hair and rip his garments, and the one who doesn't. Now, when it comes to becoming tahor from the state of confinement, he says there's no difference between the one who's mukhlat and the one who is muskar, other than the requirement to shave the hair and the bird procedure. What does that mean? That means if you were a confirmed Mitzorah, then afterwards you have to shave all your hair and you have to bring the birds. Whereas if you were just put into quarantine because it was not clear what your status was, and then it turns out that you are tahor, you become tahor, and you do not have to shave, you do not have to bring these birds. Okay, so we're saying that those are the differences. Now, what about sending the Mitzorah outside the city walls? That would apply to both of them. That would apply to both of them. So now the question is, right, where do we know this from? Where do we know what the Mishnah says that that the requirements of letting the hair grow and ripping the garments do not apply to the Mitzorah? So the Gemara says as follows. It says that Shmuel bar Yitzchok taught a brisa in the presence of Rav Huna, and he says as follows. There's a pasuk that says, then the kohen shall declare him tahor. It is a mispachas, right? Mispachas means like a discoloration. Yeah, I think that's what it is, right? It's a skin disease, but it's not saras. So he just has to immerse his garments, and then he has become cleansed, right? Now, what's the word, the Hebrew word for he has been cleansed? It says v'toher, and he has been cleansed. Now, this implies that he is cleansed even initially from the requirement of letting his hair grow and rending his garment, which means to say as follows. The pasuk could have said v'yitar, and he will become pure. What does it mean v'taher, and he has been cleansed? It means that there's something that didn't apply to him that applied to the person who was confirmed to be tamei. And what's the thing that didn't apply to him that applied to the one that was confirmed as a Mitzorah? That is the letting their hair grow and the rending of the garment. Now, Rava rejects this, and he says, if that's the case, right, when it says about Zav, v'chibes begodav, v'toher, that he has been cleansed, what does v'toher mean? That he is that over there he had somehow initially been cleansed of what, right? So rather, you have to explain that the expression "and he has become cleansed" in the context of the verse regarding Zav to mean that he's becoming cleansed from this point and on, right? From the stringency of conveying tumah to an earthenware through hesed, right? That is, even if he again experiences an emission on the seventh day after his immersion, right? He does not convey tumah to retroactively through movement. So here too, okay. Rava is saying, right? Rava is saying that your proof that you're trying to bring over here, that when it says v'toher, it's coming to teach me that there's a distinction between the muskar and the mukhlat, in that he was not obligated to let his hair grow and rend his garments. That is not the case because we have the following teaching, right? We have this idea that when a person becomes tamei, right, from a zav, and he then afterwards goes to the mikvah, right? What happens if after going to the mikvah, after he goes to the mikvah, he has another sighting, right? What happens between the time he went to the mikvah and the time that he has his sighting? Do we say that he retroactively makes everything else to be tamei, right? Or do we say that no, between the time that he went to the mikvah and the time that he had his sighting after going to the mikvah, that during that period he is tahar, and this sighting only from that point and on does he make it tamei, right? So we say, just like we say this principle by the Zohar, right? Let's say it also by the Metzora. That what? That when it says, right, that he's so over here also in the context of the confined Metzora, the expression that he has been cleansed can teach us the same thing that it taught about the Zohar, that what? That he is cleansed from this point and on from the stringency of conveying Tumah retroactively through entering a house, even if his spot subsequently grows larger and thus is declared tamei by a kohen. Which means like this: if a person was told at the end of the 7 days, listen here, I'm looking at you and you're clean, meaning to say, I don't see the simonic tumah, I don't see hairs growing from this spot, and therefore after 7 days, right, after your initial becoming your initial quarantine, right, you're not tar, you're free to go. So now when he walks into a house, right, at this point seemingly he is tar, and nothing in the house should ever become tamei, right? However, what happens if he leaves the house and after leaving the house 2 hairs suddenly grow? If those hairs suddenly grow, do we say that retroactively you go back and say that everything that was in the house, right, is tamei retroactively because these hairs grew, and who knows when, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later? Do we say retroactively? So we say this term v'taher is coming to teach me the same thing as Zohar, that between the period of time that he entered, that he was declared tahar, and the time where he subsequently sees simanim, that during that period of time he doesn't go back and convey tumah. So therefore, the source stated in the Brisa taught by Reb Shmuel, by Yitzchok, for example, to confine Metzora from growing his hair and rending his garment is unacceptable, because the expression "and he has been cleansed" does not refer to initial cleanliness. So Rava says, so then where do we learn it from? From where do we know in our Mishnah to say that Priya and Prima do not apply, the growing the hair and the rending the garments do not apply to a musgar and only to a mukhluk? He says we learn it from the verse which says V'hatzarua asher boi hanaga. It says in the pasuk, and the person in whom there is an affliction, right, his garment shall be torn and the hair of his head shall be unshorn. This implies that only the Metzora who must grow his hair and rend his garment is mi shetzarasai teluya begufoi. It's only one whose state of tzaras is contingent upon his body, which means to say like this: the person who was confined, why is he considered a Metzora? Because he's waiting for time. Once the time elapses and nothing changes in his body, so then he's not a Metzora. But the one asher boy hanaga, the one that his tzaras, the reason why he's a Metzora is because it's already there, that it's in his body. His impurity depends on upon what's already in his body, right? It's only him that the pasuk says he has to let his hair grow and he has to rend his garments. This comes to exclude somebody who the only reason why he's a Metzora is not dependent on his body, but dependent on the days of his confinement. So then Abaya says, if that's the case, what do we do with the fact when it says Kol asher hanega boy yitma, all the days that the tzaras is afflicted is in him, he shall be tamei, and his dwelling should be outside of the camp. And let's just interpret that and say that it's only the one who has it in his body that has to go out of the city walls, but the one who doesn't have it in his body, meaning it's only dependent on the days, doesn't have to leave the city walls. And if you're going to say that that's indeed the case, and we should make that distinction, we know that's not the case, because we know that both the Metzora that has it in his body and the one who we're waiting to determine whether or not it's actually Tameh, they both have to go outside the city walls, because that's what's clearly taught in the Mishnah, that there's no difference between a confined Metzora and a confined Metzora and a confirmed Metzora, other than letting the hair grow and rending the garments, which teaches us that certainly to go outside of the wall, they both have to go outside of the wall, right? So therefore, how do we therefore how do we understand this pasuk Asher Hanega boy, right? So Rava answers Abaya, and he says to him, it says Yimei and it says Kol Yimei. So when it says about going out of the city walls, it could have just said the Yimei. What does Kol Yimei mean? Kol Yimei comes to include, and it comes to include the Metzora that is a muska that he also go out. In other words, what he's saying is like this. You're right. When I say, right, when it says Asher Boy Hanoga, right? Asher Boy Hanoga means an exclusionary term. It excludes the Metzora that is only confined, not confirmed, right? You're asking, what about in the case of going outside of the city walls? Over there, it also says Asher Hanega Boy. He says, you're right. You could learn that it excludes the one who's only a confined and not a confirmed, but because the pasuk that talks about sending him outside of the wall could have said just the word Yemei, the days, but instead of saying just Yemei, it says Kol Yemei. That Kol Yemei comes to include back, comes to re-include the confined Metzora, right? That he also has to leave the city walls, and therefore he holds that his drasha of Asher Boy Hanega still applies. So said, if that's the case, right, that a confined Metzora is included in all the laws of Metzora, unless excluded by the verse, which means to say, you just answered me, Rava, that I needed to have the extra Kol Yemei. So then what about the fact that you have the requirements of shaving and bringing the birds, right? How come they don't apply to a confined Metzora, right? As it says in the Mishnah, Ein Bain, there's no difference, all right? Except for Tiglachas v'Tziporim. So how are you going to know that the Tiglachas and Tziporim, the shaving and the birds, don't apply to the Muslim, because you don't have this extra drasha of Yemei, Kol Yemei. So the Gemara answers, Abaya. So Abaya says in the pasuk, right? Says the Kohen shall go forth to the outside of the camp, and the Kohen shall look, and behold, the tzaras affliction has been healed. So this implies that the verse is only talking of someone who the tzaras needs to be healed, which means that he's a metzora that depends on becoming healed from it, which excludes, right, the one who doesn't need to be healed. He's just waiting for the days to pass. In other words, when we talk about the shaving and we talk about the offering of the birds, we say that the kohen goes out to the person who has tzaras, and the tzaras has been healed. In that case, where your tzaras was real tzaras and it was healed, then you have to shave yourself, and then you have to bring up a korban. But that excludes the one who is only waiting for time to pass and before he becomes tar. And I think we'll stop here. Any questions? This is probably the most difficult daf in the Masechta, but it is what it is. Any questions?
As long as there's no test, we're okay.
Actually, Rabbi Smith is suggesting that we should have a test. He says that it would be a good idea.
Forget about it.
To have a test on the whole first parak. So I think we should just leave out all the other pages. We'll just have a test on this stuff. And if you know this stuff, we'll assume that you know all the others. All right. I'm just kidding. Anyway, I wish you all
A written test will be
wonderful day.
easy.
Huh?
A written test will be easy.
Right. Anyway, I wish you all a wonderful day, and we'll see you Be'ezus Hashem tomorrow. Hopefully, we won't
Thank
be
you,
here
Rabbi.
forever. Sei gesund.
Thank you, Rabbi.